The History of Special Education Laws by Colleen Strain, University of Wisconsin-Superior. This is a PowerPoint presentation on the history or a timeline of special education laws, including landmark cases, rulings for setting process and procedure precedents in schools. Some keywords are special education, law, history, parents, equality, disability, and rights. Special education. According to the website, A Short History on Special Education, which I researched in addition to reading the material from our textbooks, I found some interesting facts about the beginnings of special education law. This website had kind of like a short history of special education law, so you could really wrap your head around all the different major events that has happened or have happened. Special education has about a 50-year history. It seems kind of short considering that. Since the beginning of our country, not much has been done reflecting the rights of students with special needs. We seem to have had somewhat of a scary history with how we've treated students with special needs in the past. Millions of children were denied schooling in our recent past. Legislation for equal educational opportunities really started amping up in the 70s. Once legislation began, there was a steady stream of mandates, laws, and decisions presented. The foundation for quality, individualized education in an accepting, unrestricted environment was set up. I found this short history on special education to be very interesting, as since the time I was born in the early 70s, this has really evolved while I have been growing up. So I made a connection to that. There was a grassroots campaign in the 30s where parents were really the first to fight for quality special education for their students. They were really the ones who were the catalyst in the struggle to improve their children's education. This started by the parents really advocating for more training for their kids' teachers, those teachers that worked with the deaf, hard of hearing, or intellectually disabled students. These children used to be called mentally retarded. In 1954, we have the case of Brown versus Board of Education. This was a significant time in history. We had the Civil Rights Movement, and this court case decision, Brown versus Board of Education, really extended equal protection under the law to minorities. It's a very important decision relating to the 14th Amendment, which says education must be available to all on equal terms. Emphasis on the word all. This really opened the doors for students with disabilities. So giving the equal opportunities and protections under the law for minorities meant that all students should have such terms. And this is what really was the catalyst for the beginning of special education in our country. Next in our timeline, we have 1973. The Rehabilitation Act, also known as Section 504. The 1970s was an influential decade. These years brought significant improvement to the lives of special education students. It guaranteed civil rights to all disabled people and required accommodations for disabled students in schools. So changes had to be made and more things had to be done for students that weren't done before. Furthermore, in 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was enacted, also called EHA. This act guaranteed and enforce the right of children with disabilities to receive a free, appropriate public education, which is also known as a FAPE. This also was known as Public Law 94-142. This is where the term least restrictive environment had come into fruition. That is the phrase least restrictive environment, to be with students who are not disabled to the maximum extent possible. So students weren't pushed aside, or I should say separated from other students. They were to be with students who are not disabled as much as they could. Their least restrictive environment would not be the same for every child, though. It would depend on the individual student's needs as to which environment would be least restrictive for them. It would vary. This act was really the foundation of modern-day special education in our country. It was reauthorized in 1990 and in 1997 and became renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is also known as IDEA. In my research, I found a website called the Learning Disabilities Association. And in the research that I read, this association was instrumental in actually writing the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So I've done some inquiring on this website, and I plan to further using it as a resource in my job as a teacher, but also with my own child who does have an IEP as a 10th grade high school student. Next, we have 1990, where we had the Americans with Disabilities Act, called ADA, passed. There is Title II for public schools and Title III, which addresses private schools. The Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination of all disabled persons from birth to death. I read about this act and added it to the timeline from our textbook, McCarthy, Cambron, McCabe, and Eckes, 2014. Had a section on this act in our timeline of 1990. The Individual with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, really emphasized the use of individual education plans, or IEPs, for all special education students. That is, services would be provided for these students. These services are provided to millions of students that were previously denied access to an appropriate education. Free, appropriate public education is a guaranteed right. There was a case called Board of Education versus Rowley that shared, though, that IDEA is to give an appropriate education, not necessarily the best. IDEA is to give a basic floor of opportunity, which is quoted from our text, McCarthy et al., 2014. IDEA has been reauthorized. It has been reauthorized in 1997 and 2004. According to the website, the Learning Disabilities Association examines how the law works in practice and what is needed to make it more clear, efficient, and effective. So the idea is that IDEA is to be evaluated and updated about every 5 years. So knowing that the law is not just final and not ever looked at or adjusted again, in my opinion, is very reflective. So we'll see where it evolves in the future. In 2001 and 2004, we had the No Child Left Behind Act. It provided further accountability to schools and did have some positives in terms of special education because it added technology assistance and loan programs to help students and schools acquire more resources resources for special education needs. In 2015, we have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, also called ESSA, ESEA, and it is due for reauthorization also. There are recommendations on the website that I have learned about called the Learning Disabilities Association of America, which have some ideas on how we could improve upon this act even more since it is due for reauthorization. In conclusion, according to the Department of Education, we have approximately 6 million children, roughly 10% of our school-aged children who receive special education services. And this was from an article called The History of Special Education, which was in 2002. So that number is probably higher, seeing though that it's 17 years later now. The rights of students really have expanded since the 1970s or 1975. But the question is, what is the future for special education? We've gone through the timeline of the past, but what does the future hold? Some of my research that I found really brings up response to intervention, or RTI, right now, and how that is having a big impact on special education in terms of what we are doing with students, how we are evaluating their progress, and even how we might be recommending students for special education. Having that response to intervention piece in first over a certain period of time to see if students really might be evaluated or not, or recommended, that is, for special education as a question. So response to intervention seems to be the hot button or hot topic issue right now in education that may or may not impact special education. Another question for the future of special education law are funding, or is funding. What kind of funding and access issues might there be in the future? And how will these laws be reauthorized, or reevaluated and reauthorized, or how might they change? And could there possibly be some new acts in our future? So we have gone through the history and the timeline of special education, but we don't know what the future might bring. Some references I used were some articles that I found online. The Short History of Special Education really wrapped my head around the history and the laws that I read about in our textbooks that are listed here. Another reference I used was the website rethinkingschools.org, which is a phenomenal website, in my opinion, that really taps into a lot of great issues in education today. And I found one about the history of education, special education. And lastly, a real recent article in 2019 was Special Education is Broken from edweek.org, which brought up some interesting questions for the future of special education. Thank you.